The bouncer put a hand the size of a dinner plate against the brass door, and the woman in the grey velvet gown stepped back onto the marble steps so she would not be touched. Rain was just starting. It beaded on the shoulders of her dress, the dress she had spent $4 on at a church thrift sale and 7 evenings remaking by hand, and it ran down the back of her neck while 200 guests laughed behind glass 40 feet away. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She held a single cream envelope against her chest, both hands flat over it the way a person holds something that is the only proof they have, and she looked up at the man and said, very quietly, that there had been a mistake. He told her there was no mistake. He had his orders. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was whose handwriting was inside that envelope. He had been told to remove the woman in the cheap dress, and he had done it, and he believed the night was now back in order. The night was not back in order. It had not even begun to be what it was going to be. Her name was Imani Rhodes, and 3 weeks before this rain, she had been standing at a folding table in the basement of a community centre on the east side of the city, teaching a 58-year-old man named Hollis how to read the word because she was 34. She had a daughter, Maya, who was 9 and slept in the smaller of their 2 rooms with a nightlight shaped like a moon, and she had a sewing machine on the kitchen table that her grandmother had left her, and she had a folder of attendance sheets she carried everywhere because the program she ran on Tuesday and Thursday nights was not officially anything. It had no budget line, it had no letterhead, it was 11 adults who could not read well, and a woman who taught them for free in a borrowed basement after her shift. Her shift was at a dry cleaner on Vesper Street, where she pressed other people's good clothes for $9 an hour. She had worked there 6 years. She knew the weight of every fabric that came across the counter, which is part of why the velvet gown looked the way it did when she finally finished it, because she understood cloth the way some people understand music. The owner of the dry cleaner, a tired, kind woman named Gwen, let her stay late on Wednesdays to use the steam press for her own small mending jobs, and that was how Imani made the little extra that kept the lights on in the months when the rent went up and the hours did not. The basement smelled of burnt coffee and old paper, and the light came from 2 long fluorescent tubes, one of which had hummed and flickered for as long as Imani had taught there. The seats were folding chairs. The tables were the kind churches lend out for potlucks. On the wall behind her there was a strip of butcher paper where every student wrote his own name the day he learned to, and there were 11 names on it now, in 11 shaky hands, and the oldest of them, Hollis, had signed his twice, once the first night and once a year later. And the difference between the 2 signatures was the whole reason Imani did the work. The first was a child's scrawl drawn by a grown man's hand. The second was a name written by someone who knew it belonged to him. She had no idea that ordinary Tuesday in the basement, that a letter was already being written that would put her name on the lips of the richest family in the city. She was correcting Hollis, gently telling him that the C in because was soft, like an S, and Hollis was nodding the way grown men nod when they are ashamed and grateful at the same time. He had worked the same loading dock for 30 years and had hidden his reading the whole time, signing forms with an X and telling people his classes were in the truck. And the day he first came down those basement stairs, he had stood in the doorway for 10 full minutes before he could make himself walk in. Imani had not rushed him. She had pulled out a chair and waited. She knew the look. It was the look of a person deciding whether it was safe to be seen. Outside the basement, the rain that would later find the gala steps was still 3 weeks away. To understand the letter, you have to understand a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor Frost had died 11 months earlier at the age of 81, and the city had put her face on the side of a bus and called her a philanthropist, which she had been, though she would have hated the word. What the city did not put on the bus was the part of her life that mattered most of all. For the last 15 years of her life, Eleanor Frost had quietly funded a single adult literacy program on the East Side. 1 basement, 11 seats, and she had never once allowed her name to be attached to it. She paid for the workbooks. She paid the rent on the room. When the previous teacher moved away, it was Eleanor who found the young woman who had been volunteering on the side, the seamstress from the dry cleaner, who stayed after to help a coworker fill out a citizenship form, and asked her, in a handwritten note, if she would take it on. That young woman was Imani. She had kept the note. She kept all of Eleanor's notes because Eleanor wrote by hand in a slanting old-fashioned script that pressed hard into the paper, and because the notes were the only evidence that the work was seen by anyone at all. For 3 years, the two of them never met in a grand room. They met in the basement. Eleanor would come on a Thursday, in a plain coat, sit in the back and listen to a man named Hollis sound out a word, and afterward she would press a hand to Imani's arm and say the same thing every time. She would say, "You are doing the Lord's quiet work, and the Lord keeps a long memory." Then Eleanor died, and the notes stopped, and Imani assumed the funding would stop too, because that is how the world usually goes. She kept the program running on her own $9 wages and the little she made on Wednesdays at the steam press. She did not ask anyone for anything. She did not know how to ask. For 11 months, she carried it alone. The envelope on the gala steps had arrived 10 days before the rain. It came in the mail to her apartment, heavy cream paper, her name spelled correctly, Imani Rhodes, and inside was a letter from a man named Adrian Frost. Adrian was Eleanor's son, 46 years old, the head now of the family foundation, a man whose photograph was in the business pages and whose face Imani had never seen in person. The letter was short. He wrote that he had been going through his mother's private papers for almost a year. He wrote that he had found in a locked drawer in her study a folder she had kept on a basement program no one in the foundation had ever heard of, and that inside the folder were 3 years of letters from a woman named Imani Rhodes. Attendance sheets, photographs of grown men holding up their first signed names. He wrote that his mother had left a final instruction in her own hand unwitnessed, never entered into the official will, asking that on the night of the Foundation's annual gala, her seat of honor go to the teacher who had carried the basement work after her. He wrote that he intended to keep that instruction. He asked Imani to come as the guest of honor, and he signed it, and he enclosed a second, smaller paper, a photocopy of his mother's last handwritten line. Imani read it 4 times, standing at her kitchen counter, with Maya asking what was wrong, and then she sat down on the floor with her back against the cabinet and cried for the first time in a year. She had no idea what that envelope would have to survive before the night was over. She almost did not go. A gala is a wall of money, and she had no armor for it. She had a daughter to feed and a closing shift on the night in question that Gwen, when she heard, would not hear of her working. Gwen took her hands across the counter at the dry cleaner and told her she was going to that gala if Gwen had to drive her there herself. So Marnie decided to go. She had nothing to wear, which is where the dress comes in, and the dress is the heart of the matter, so it deserves to be told properly. She went to the church thrift sale on a Saturday with $11 in her pocket and Maya holding her hand. The sale was in a fellowship hall with cookies on a card table and a woman at the cash box who knew Imani by name, and the racks were the usual run of donated coats and faded blouses. On a rack near the back, between a man's windbreaker and a child's Halloween costume, she found a grey velvet gown from some decade long gone, too big in the shoulders, the hem water-stained, a seam split under one arm, $4 on a paper tag. She held it up to the light. Where another shopper saw ruined velvet, Imani saw the nap of the fabric still good, the grain still true, the kind of weight that does not exist in cheap clothes anymore. Maya wrinkled her nose at the water stain. Imani showed her the inside of the hem where the dye had never faded and told her that a stain on the outside of good cloth is just a thing that happened to it, not a thing it is, and that you can almost always turn the truth of a fabric to where the light will find it. She bought it. She spent 7 evenings on it after Maya was asleep, at the kitchen table under the one good lamp, with the grandmother's machine humming low so as not to wake the child. She took in the shoulders an inch on each side. She lifted the hem and pressed it twice. She turned the worn places to the inside, where no one would ever see them. The collar she built by hand from a length of darker velvet she had saved off a coat nobody claimed at the cleaner, sitting up past midnight with the needle and a thimble, worn shiny at the tip, setting each stitch so small that from a foot away the seam disappeared. On the 7th night she tried it on at 1 in the morning and stood very still in the bathroom mirror, and what she saw was not a thrift store dress. It was the thing she could do that no money could buy, made visible. When she finished, the gown did not look new. It looked made. It fit her like it had been grown on her, and in the morning when Maya saw it on her she clapped, and Imani let herself believe for one evening that she could walk into that room and belong. The gala was held in the ballroom of a hotel downtown, the kind with a marble lobby and a doorman and a ceiling so high the chandeliers looked like distant weather. Gwen dropped her at the curb in the rain and squeezed her hand and said she would be circling the block. Imani went up the marble steps with the cream envelope in her small black bag, because the letter told her to present herself at the door, and she presented herself, and the trouble started before she ever reached the room. The trouble had a name, and the name was Camille Devereaux. Camille was 51 years old, the chair of the gala committee, and she had run the foundation's social calendar for 19 years through Eleanor's last decade and into Adrian's first year at the head of the table. She considered the gala hers. She considered the guest list hers. She had not been told about a guest of honor named Imani Rhodes because Adrian, who did not love Camille and did not entirely trust her, had handled the invitation privately and meant to introduce his mother's teacher himself from the stage as a surprise. Camille hated surprises she had not arranged. She was standing just inside the door in cream silk and a heavy gold cuff when the doorman's radio crackled about a woman at the entrance claiming to be an invited guest, and Camille came out herself, heels clicking on marble to handle it. She looked Imani up and down one time. The velvet gown, the careful collar, the rain in her hair, the worn black bag, and her face did the small, cruel arithmetic that the comfortable do without knowing they are doing it. She decided in under 2 seconds what Imani was. She decided Imani was a mistake. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to either. She said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, that this was a private event, that perhaps Imani was looking for the service entrance, and that the staff coordinator would be happy to help her find her way. Imani took the cream envelope out of her bag and held it out and said that she had been invited. She said the name, Adrian Frost. She watched something flicker across Camille's face, a flinch of recognition and then a hardening, because Camille knew that name better than anyone in the building, and the last thing Camille wanted was a stranger in a thrift store dress invoking it at her door in front of arriving guests. Camille did not take the envelope. She glanced at it the way a person glances at something they have already decided is fake. She said, still smiling, that anyone could print a letter, that the foundation received a great many requests, and that she was sure Imani understood how these things worked. She said the word people. "These people," she said, lowering her voice as if to spare them both, "sometimes get the wrong idea about an event like this." Then she lifted one finger, just one, toward the doorman, and the doorman put his dinner plate hand against the brass door, and that is how a woman who had been named a guest of honor in a dead woman's last handwriting came to be standing on wet marble in the rain, with 200 strangers laughing behind glass. The rain came harder now. It found the careful collar she had built by hand and beaded along the velvet, and began to soak through to the cold of her shoulders. Behind the glass a string quartet was playing something bright, and a waiter passed a tray of small gold things she would never taste, and the laughter rose and fell like weather in a country she was not allowed to enter. A woman under the awning in a fur stole looked at her once and then looked away, the way you look away from a thing that embarrasses you to have seen. She could have left. Gwen was circling the block. The car was warm. Maya was waiting at home with the moon nightlight, and no one in that ballroom knew Imani existed, and the simplest thing in the world, the thing almost anyone would have done, was to walk down the marble steps into the rain and let the cream envelope go soft and ruined in her bag and never speak of this to a living soul. She did not leave. She stood on the steps in the rain, and she thought about Hollis sounding out the word. Because she thought about Eleanor in the back of the basement in her plain coat, pressing a hand to her arm, saying, "The Lord keeps a long memory." She thought about her grandmother's sewing machine and the 7 evenings of stitching and the $4 tag. And she understood, standing there, that the dress was not the thing being judged. She was. And she had spent 34 years being judged by people who had decided what she was before she opened her mouth, and she had let it slide off her every time because fighting it cost more than she had. This time the cost was already paid. The letter was real. The work was real. The dead woman's instruction was real. And for once in her life, Imani decided she was not going to walk down the steps. She wiped the rain from her face with the back of her hand. She put the envelope back against her chest, both palms flat over it, and she turned and went back up to the brass door. This time, she did not ask the doorman. She asked him to call inside for Adrian Frost. She said the name calmly, the way you say a thing you are certain of, and she said that she would wait right there, on the steps, in the rain, until someone brought Mr. Bratt. Frost the message that his mother's teacher was at the door. The doorman hesitated. Something in how she said his mother's teacher, with no anger in it, only a terrible steadiness, made him hesitate. And in that hesitation, Camille reappeared. Now, Camille was not smiling. A small crowd of arriving guests had gathered under the awning out of the rain, and they were watching. And Camille understood that a scene was forming around her, and the worst thing a woman like Camille can imagine is a scene she did not script. She came down 2 steps. She lowered her voice to the register people use for threats, dressed as concern. She told Imani that if she did not leave the property, security would remove her and that a charge could be filed. And did Imani really want that? A woman like her, with that to explain, she let the word like hang in the air. A woman like her. Imani looked at her for a long moment. Then she said the only thing she said to Camille that whole night, and she said it without raising her voice, because she did not need to. She said, "You knew Eleanor for 10 years. I knew her in a basement. You should have recognized her handwriting." And she turned the photocopy in her hand so that the gathered guests under the awning could see it, the small enclosed paper, the dead woman's last line in that hard-pressed slanting script that half the people in that building had seen on 100 place cards and thank-you notes over the years. The script that was on the very program in their hands that night, because Eleanor Frost's signature was the foundation's emblem. A man near the door went still. He had been on the foundation board for 12 years. He knew that handwriting in his sleep. He looked at the photocopy and then he looked at Camille, and the first crack ran through the evening. What happened next happened fast, and then it happened slowly, the way the most important moments do. The board member stepped forward and asked quietly if he might see the paper. He was an older man, grey at the temples, and he held a foundation program in his other hand. The printed kind with Eleanor's signature reproduced along the bottom edge the way it had been on foundation paper for 30 years. Imani let him hold the photocopy, not let go of it, only tilt it under the awning light. He looked from the photocopy to the program in his own hand and back, the live line and the printed one, the same hard-pressed slant, the same way the cross of the T came down hard and trailed off. He read the line. His face changed. He read it again. Then he asked Imani her name, and she told him Imani Rhodes. And he said the name out loud, as if testing whether it weighed what he thought it weighed. A younger woman beside him made a small sound and put a hand to her mouth, because she had been Eleanor's personal assistant in the last years, and she had typed correspondence to a basement program on the east side more than once, addressed to a name she had never been able to put a face to. And the face was standing in front of her in the rain in a grey velvet gown, and it was nothing at all like the woman Camille had described. Camille said the letter was a forgery. She said it loudly now, because loud was all she had left. She said anyone could trace that signature, that the foundation had been targeted by people before, that this was exactly the kind of thing the gala committee existed to prevent. And here is the thing about Camille that the night was about to make plain. She was not a cartoon. She was not twirling a mustache. She genuinely could not conceive that the woman in the $4 dress could be the one Eleanor had chosen, because in 19 years Camille had built her whole sense of herself on being the one who stood closest to the family, who guarded the door, who decided who was worthy of the room. To admit that a dry cleaner who could barely make rent had been closer to Eleanor's actual heart than Camille had ever been was to lose the only thing Camille had. So she fought. She mounted a real defense. She demanded the police be called to document an attempted fraud. She instructed the doorman to photograph Imani for the record. She turned to the gathering crowd and worked them, naming the prominent guests by name, reminding them whose evening this was, building in real time a story in which she was the protector and Imani was the threat. And for about 90 seconds it almost worked, because money tilts a room and the instinct of a crowd is to side with the woman in silk over the woman in rain. Then the brass door opened from the inside and Adrian Frost came out. He was a tall man with his mother's hard-pressed economy of movement, in a dark charcoal suit, and he had come out because the younger woman, Eleanor's old assistant, had slipped inside and found him at the head table and said 3 words that made him put down his glass and stand. The 3 words were, "Your mother's teacher." He came out onto the marble steps into the cold and the rain, and he saw a woman in a grey velvet gown holding a cream envelope against her chest, and he saw Camille mid-sentence with a finger raised, and he understood the shape of it before a single person explained. He did not raise his voice either. The family did not raise their voices. He asked Imani gently if she was Imani Rhodes. She said she was. He asked if she was the one who taught the Tuesday and Thursday program in the basement on the east side, the one with the man named Hollis, and she said yes, because his mother had written that name down too, in the folder, and Adrian had read it. And then Adrian Frost did a thing that none of the guests under the awning ever forgot. He took the wet hand of the woman in the thrift store dress, and in front of the social chair who had just tried to have her arrested, he bowed his head over it, the way you do over the hand of someone your family owes a debt, and he said he was sorry. He said his mother had asked for this, and he had failed to make sure the door knew her name, and he was sorry, and would she please come in, because the seat at the head of the table was hers and had been hers since before he ever wrote the letter. Camille had stopped talking. The crowd that had almost turned against Imani turned now the way crowds do, all at once and with no memory of which way they had been leaning a moment before. Imani did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Camille. She looked at Adrian, and she asked him one quiet question, the only thing she wanted to know. She asked whether the program would be all right now, whether the rent on the basement would be paid. Because for 11 months she had been carrying it alone on $9 an hour and standing on those steps soaked through. That was the thing she was afraid of. Not the humiliation, not Camille, only that the work might stop. And Adrian, who had walked out expecting to write an insult, understood in that moment that he was not dealing with someone who wanted the room. He was dealing with someone who wanted the basement. And that, more than the letter, more than the handwriting, was when he knew his mother had chosen exactly right. He told her the program would never want for anything again as long as the foundation stood. And then he walked her in. She came back through the brass door, not on luck and not on rescue, though it looked like rescue to the crowd. She came back in because the work she had done quietly for 3 years was real, and real things, given enough time, become impossible to throw out into the rain. The letter only opened the door. What walked through it was 3 years of Tuesday and Thursday nights. The ballroom was everything she had imagined and somehow did not touch her the way she had feared it would. The chandeliers, the long tables, the wall of money, all of it parted around her as Adrian walked her up the center of the room to the head table, and the strange thing, the thing she told Gwen about later, was how quiet it had become. 200 people who had been laughing behind glass were not laughing now. They were watching a man in a charcoal suit seat, a woman in a grey velvet gown in the chair of honour with his own hands, and many of them did not yet know the whole story, and all of them could feel that something true was happening in a room not usually built for true things. There was a program of speeches that night, and Adrian tore up the one he had planned. He stood at the small podium, and he did not talk about endowments. He told the room about a locked drawer in his mother's study and a folder no one had known about, and 3 years of letters from a basement on the east side. He told them his mother had funded 11 seats and a teacher and had forbidden anyone to attach her name to it because she believed, he said, that the work done in the dark counted most of all, the thing a person does in an empty room with no applause coming. He said that for almost a year after she died, he had wondered what his mother had actually believed, underneath all the buildings with her name on them, and that he had found his answer in that drawer. Her answer was a woman named Imani Rhodes, who had kept teaching for 11 months on her own wages after the note stopped coming, asking no one for anything. He asked Imani to stand. She stood in the gown she had made with her own hands, and she did not make a speech because she was not maker of speeches. She said thank you. She said the names of her students, all 11 of them, Hollis first. She said that the work was not hers, it was Eleanor's, and that she had only carried it where you carry something heavy a little way down the road for someone who can no longer carry it themselves. Then she sat down, and the whole wall of money stood up. Camille Devereaux was not in the room when they stood. She had left during the speech, quietly, the way people leave when the floor has gone out from under the only thing holding them up. No one removed her, no security walked her out. There was no scene, because Imani never asked for one, and Adrian never offered one. And that is the thing about how this niche of the world settles its debts. The arrogant are not dragged into the street, they are simply left standing in a room where everyone now knows what they did, and they find they cannot breathe there, and they go. Camille resigned from the gala committee within the week in a short, cold email, and the foundation accepted it within the hour, and that was the whole of her punishment, which was also the entire weight of it. She had spent 19 years making herself the keeper of the door. She would spend the rest of her life knowing she had thrown the guest of honor out into the rain because of a $4 dress, and that the dead woman she had served for a decade had loved a basement teacher better than she had ever loved Camille. No one had to do anything else to her. The truth was enough. It would have been a fine place to leave it, that one shining night, the wealthy room rising for the overlooked teacher, the social chair undone. A night like that lifts you and then sends you home, and if home is still a long shift for poor wages, the lifting fades by morning. Imani's life did not fade by morning. What Eleanor had set in motion and what her son completed was not a single warm evening. It was the rest of her life. In the spring, the foundation did 3 things, and Imani was in the room for all of them. It put the East Side program on a permanent endowment, the rent and the workbooks, and a real salary for the teacher so that the 11 seats became 40 seats in 3 rooms, and the basement on the East Side got a proper sign over the door, and the sign did not say Eleanor Frost because Eleanor had never wanted it to. It said, in plain letters, "The Quiet Work," which was the phrase from her last handwritten line, the same line on the photocopy Imani had held up in the rain. People who walked past it assumed it was a poem. The people inside knew it was a promise being kept. The second thing was Imani's salary, and the number is worth saying out loud, because a number is the difference between a warm feeling and a changed life. She went from $9 an hour to dry cleaner to $48,000 a year, running the literacy programs across the East Side, enough that she gave Gwen her notice with tears and a long hug, and enough that the rent going up in the winter stopped being the thing she lay awake over. Maya got the bigger of the 2 rooms. The moon nightlight moved with her, and the sewing machine that had been her grandmother's stayed on the kitchen table, not because Imani needed the extra money from mending anymore, but because she found she could not stop making things with her hands, and because Maya had started to ask to learn. The third thing took longer and mattered most. Adrian, who had walked out onto those steps, a stranger to his mother's real heart, did not go back to being a name in the business pages. He started coming to the basement on Thursdays. The first time, the students went stiff and quiet at the sight of the suit, and Hollis stopped reading mid-sentence, certain he had done something wrong. Imani crossed the room and stood beside the older man and put her hand flat on the table the way she always did, and she told the room this was Eleanor's son, and that he had come the same way his mother used to sit in the back and listen, and that nobody had to perform for him. Then she nodded at Hollis to go on. He went on. After a few weeks the suit stopped coming and a plain jacket came instead, and Adrian learned to sit in the back of a church basement under a flickering tube and say nothing for an hour, which is a harder thing for a man of his standing to learn than anyone gives it credit for. One Thursday in early summer, Hollis, who had been working at it for a year and a half, asked if he could read something he had brought. He took out a thin children's book with a worn cover, the kind sold free for $1 at the same thrift sale where Imani had found her gown, and he said his granddaughter was turning 6 and he wanted to be the one to read to her at the party, and he wanted to practice in front of people first so his hands would stop shaking when it counted. Then he read a full page aloud without stopping. He read about a small bear who could not find his way home and the friends who walked him there, and his voice caught only once on the word remember, and he pushed through it, and he read to the bottom of the page and looked up. The room was silent. Then the room came apart. 11 grown people and a foundation head and a teacher in a plain dress. All of them undone over a single page, read all the way through, the kind of thing the world hands out no trophies for and never reports. Dadrian wept openly and did not wipe his face. He told Imani afterward on the basement steps in the warm evening that he finally understood what his mother had meant. The quiet work. The thing no one claps for. He had been to 1,000 galas, he said, and shaken 1,000 hands, and signed checks with more zeros than he could feel. He had never, until that summer, been in a room where something actually changed inside a person, while he watched. The gala was only the night the truth came out. The real gift came after, in the ordinary weeks, every Thursday, the salary, the bigger room, the sign over the door, the man reading to his granddaughter. The rain and the dress are what people remember, because shame and rescue are what stay with you. The quieter truth is the 11 months before, when she carried it alone and no one clapped, and the years after, when it grew. Somewhere there is a person in your own life who did the faithful work that no one ever saw. Hold their face in your mind for a moment before we go on, because they are remembered too, even if no one ever told them so. The grey velvet gown went back into the closet where it hangs still, because Imani would no more throw it out than throw out the sewing machine. Maya asked her once why she kept it, the dress that got her thrown into the rain, and Imani thought about it and said that the dress had not gotten her thrown out. People had. The dress had only told the truth about her bank account, and the truth had never been the problem. The problem was a room full of people who thought a bank account was a soul. She told Maya that you keep the gown that taught you that, the same way you keep a scar, because it is proof you walked through something and came out the door on the right side of it. There was one more letter near the end of that first year, and it is one everything had quietly been moving toward. It came from Imani, not to her. She wrote it by hand because she had learned from Eleanor that the things that matter are written by hand, in a slanting script of her own that pressed hard into the paper, the way you write when you mean it. She wrote it to Maya and she put it in a drawer, not to be opened yet, the way Eleanor had left a line in a drawer to be found after she was gone. In it, she told her daughter the whole story of the rain and the dress and the steps, the parts Maya had been too young to be told. And she ended it with a line she had carried in her own chest since the basement, the line Eleanor used to say with a hand on her arm, the line that was now carved in plain letters over a door on the east side. She wrote that the Lord keeps a long memory and so does the world even when people do not, and that the quiet, faithful thing you do when no one is watching is exactly the thing that comes back in its own time to carry you. She wrote that she had learned it on a wet marble step in a $4 dress, and that she hoped Maya would learn it somewhere gentler, but that however she learned it, it was true. She did not sign it Imani Rhodes, she signed it Mama. Then she put the letter in the drawer, and she turned off the kitchen light, and she stood for a moment in the dark of the small apartment that was not so small anymore, and she listened to her daughter breathing in the next room under the moon nightlight, and she let herself feel all the way down the thing she had not let herself feel on the steps in the rain because there had been no room for it. Then she had been seen. After 34 years of pressing other people's good clothes for $9 an hour, of teaching in a borrowed basement, of carrying a dead woman's work alone for 11 months and asking no one for anything, she had been seen, and not by a crowd, and not by the wall of money that stood up for her one shining night. She had been seen by a woman in a plain coat in the back of a basement years before any of it, a woman who had pressed a hand to her arm and known exactly what she was looking at and written it down in a locked drawer so that the world would have to know it too someday after she was gone. Imani went down the short hall and looked in on Maya asleep, one arm flung out, the moon casting its small, steady light on the wall. She pulled the blanket up over her daughter's shoulder, and the last thing she did before she went to bed, the small, ordinary thing that closed the year, was reach out and straighten the nightlight on the dresser so that the moon sat level, the way she liked it, casting its quiet, faithful light over the sleeping child in the bigger of the two rooms, in the home that no one could put her out of, on in the rain that had long since stopped.